Welcome back to Advanced Photo Manipulation Movie Poster Effects. My name is Kirk Nelson, and we are now on lesson number 11. And this is the lesson that we take a look at the environment surrounding this giant fighting robot. Okay, so here's where we left our giant robot after the last lesson. Now, I have done a little bit of grouping work over here just to keep things a little easier to look at visually, so we're not getting lost in a sea of layers within these groups. We can just condense them down, and it's really easy to deal with here. Because the focus of this lesson is working with this background area and the environment that's surrounding this robot. We want to make sure it matches as far as the look and feel of the scene. We want to make sure that the lighting is somewhat consistent and that the color tones are all matching up. And we want to make sure that it looks pretty good. Because looking at this shot here, I like the buildings in here. I think this makes for a great setting for him. But the sky leaves a little something to be desired. In fact, I would like to swap out this sky with this one, because I like the clouds in here. I think they look a lot more interesting. So let's start out by creating a selection of the sky area. The quick selection tool, as would be expected, makes a quick selection of that area. We got to touch it up a little bit near the corners. We'll use the refine edge tool to try to get a little bit of a radius work in along where those antennas are and along the parking lights in that background. Okay, so then we can come over to this sky scene here that we like and just use the move tool. Drag this over and deposit it right into this scene, and then that selection is still active, so we will use that as a layer mask. And then I want to transform this layer so that we can scale it around and position it in here exactly how we like it to be. But I don't want to transform the mask. So I click this little icon here, this little chain link, to unlink the mask from the layer. That way, when I use my transformation tools, it slides around within that masked area. And I don't have to worry about distorting the mask because it's not being transformed. It's only transforming the pixels of that layer. Okay, so once we position it as we like it, now let's switch this blending mode to linear burn. And what that does is allows some of the background from the previous photo to come through. For instance, we can well see those parking guides and that antenna up at the top. We still get a nice cloud effect from the new sky file. Okay, so now I want to adjust the contrast of the entire scene. And I will do that by adding a curves adjustment layer and generating the standard S curve. Okay, that adds a nice contrasted element to it. Now this next one I'm going to add because I want to do sort of a selective desaturation on the background. I find this blue to be a little bit intense, and I find even the saturation of the buildings to be a little bit hot because it draws interest away from the robot itself. So what I'm going to use is a gradient map. And this gradient map I'm going to place below the curves layer. Now, it's doing some weird stuff to the background right now because the point of this adjustment layer is that it takes the dark colored pixels on the left and maps it to whatever color is assigned to that part of the gradient ramp, and takes the light colored pixels of the image and maps it to whatever color is on the right side of the gradient ramp. Previously, I created my own poster background gradient, and I'll explore that a little bit. That is essentially 4 stops. There's the black on the far left, white on the far right. So the white is white, the black is black. That's to be expected. But then at about that first 1/5 mark coming in, this color stop here is a mid-tone gray. And then approximately the same distance in from the black is a deep blue. All right, and if we take a look at what that does to the background, it pulls out a lot of that saturation and adds almost a nighttime color cast to it. But of course, don't want it to look like this exactly. I want to control the application of this effect. And fortunately, the adjustment layer comes with a mask built right in. So I can use my brush, set to black, nice soft brush, keep the opacity low, and then begin removing that effect from the areas that I think it needs to be pulled out just a little bit from. Things like the trees should have a little bit of green left in them. The buildings in the back should have a little tint of color left. Not fully saturated like they were, but certainly not that blue pale. Okay, the next step is to add a shadow from this robot being cast down here into the parking lot. We can take a look at the shadows that are already established in the scene to basically tell what direction the lighting is. Now, it is an overcast day, so there's not a lot of very prominent shadows, but if you look back here where the trees are, you can see that it's mostly overhead, but a slight tilt forward and then to the right. So that's the angle that we want to replicate with the shadow for the robot. Now, to create that, I've got the base robot layer here. I'm going to add a new merged layer from that. So that's Control, Alt, E, or Command Option E on the Macintosh. And so that gives us this merged copy of the robot, which I'm going to lock the pixels of, and then I'm going to fill with a deep bluish color that I'm selecting from that background. Then I'll unlock those pixels and add a slight blur to this. Gaussian blur, just a couple of pixels wide. Okay, now the technique for making this appear to be a shadow is to transform it into the opposite direction, scale it down, and skew it over. Okay, and then it should be positioned underneath that group, so clearly it's underneath the feet there. Then we will change it to multiply and reduce the opacity. And then we've got a nice convincing shadow. Okay, so one of the other things that we always want to pay attention to when creating a artificial scene like this is we want to be mindful of any type of interaction this figure would have with the environment. For instance, this building has a big glass side on it here, and it's right at that angle that you would expect to see a reflection of this figure in that glass. That may sound daunting and intimidating, but it's really not that bad. So first of all, what we need to do is create a selection of that building back there. So let's get the robot out of the way again and just create a really rough outline of that reflective surface. And then just copy that to a new layer with Control or Command J. I'm going to move that up above the curves in the gradient map adjustment layers. Once again, make a merged layer of the robot. Then I'm going to pull down and clip to that reflective side of the building that I just made a copy of. All right, and then you see where this is going. Transform that down. Something about like that. Now, clearly, if the reflection is of his back, we wouldn't see some of these elements that are unique to his front, although the reflection's not going to be clear. If he has these glowing eye windows, it's going to become rather obvious that it's not the back that's being reflected. So we need to paint some of those things out. Same with his detail of the chest, those fan things up in there. Just enough to make it look like it could be the back of him and not necessarily the front. It's really the outline that tends to be most important because that's what catches the eye and that's how people realize what that is. It's not the details on the inside, it's the contour. So we've got that done in there. Set this to soft light. Pull down the opacity. It's about 75% or so. And we've got a decent looking reflection, but it's still not quite right because if you look at the reflection that's already in the photo, like of this other building, it's all distorted. It's not mirror perfect because each of these panes of glass is creating their own reflection and they're not all perfectly even and they're not all one piece. So to simulate that, we will go to Filter, Filter Gallery, and in the Distort folder, use the Glass Distortion. And then you just crank that smoothness all the way up to 15 and start increasing the distortion enough until things become, well, distorted. All right, that's got a good distortion in there now. But if you'll notice, we're getting that reflection to be over the parts that are not really reflective materials. That's the black lines that are in between those panes of window. Well, that's just regular construction material. That doesn't have a reflection to it. It's only the windows do. So no, we are not going to go through and draw 1,000 rectangles to cut out the reflection. Not at all. We're going to do things a little bit easier than that. This base selection we created here of the reflective side, let's make a copy of that and bring that up and also clip that back to it. And let's set this to multiply. Now the point there is that the dark areas are then going to be blacked out and the other areas are going to be darkened. But that's not what we want either. So we need to make those regular areas that are not dark even less not dark or lighter. Let's do that using a levels adjustment where we just greatly increase the contrast. And that looks pretty good. So now we've got an environment that matches most of the lighting within this robot. We've got a nice shadow being cast on the ground. We've replaced the sky, and we've got a reflection on that back building. Okay, guys, that completes lesson 11. We've done a lot of nice environmental work there. The next lesson, lesson 12, you're not going to want to miss it. We will start dealing with the lighting effects of this piece, where we can add some dramatic lighting, and we can start tying everything together and really making this thing work. See you then.